Hello, everyone. My name is Krupali. I'm an assistant coordinator with Let's Talk Science. I'd like to welcome you to our webinar about human evolution. Next slide, please. Okay, before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that the University of Manitoba campuses are located on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji Cree, Dakota, and Dene people, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and the mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with the Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. Okay, so just some housekeeping notes. You're welcome to ask any questions via chat. Do not share any personal information as this is a recorded webinar, and have your cameras off throughout the webinar with only your first name. Yeah, so I'm going to pass it off to Shanae to take it off.
Awesome, thank you. So my name is Shanae, and I'm actually a Let's Talk Science volunteer, and I'm a representative for the University of Manitoba Anthropology Student Association, and we're partnering with Let's Talk Science to bring you webinars like these, and we'll hopefully have a few more over the coming months. So today we have Dr. Benjamin Collins, and he's an archaeologist here at the University of Manitoba. His research focuses on how past forager populations adapted to rapid climate changes in southern Africa from 150,000 years ago to the recent past. Specifically, he's interested in how changes in artifact styles across space and through time reflect past social networks and how these networks insulated past peoples from rapid and disadvantageous changes in climate and environment. So today he's going to talk to you guys about human evolution, and I will hand it off to him. And thank you everyone for coming.
Yeah, thanks Shanae and Krupali. I really appreciate that. And thanks to everyone who is watching today, and shout out to everyone who used the recorded lecture as well. So yeah, my name's Ben. I'm an archaeologist with the University of Manitoba. And today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about human evolution. So I'm going to share my screen here to have some slides. So let me just get that sorted out. Okay, so can everyone see my screen there? Perfect. All right, so the kind of structure for the talk is we'll talk a little bit about very briefly like how human evolution is studied, how it's kind of part of broader anthropology and some of the different fields. And then we'll talk about some of the major themes in human evolution. Because, human evolution is a long-term process and incredibly complex, but there's a couple of major themes that seem to run through the, 5 to 6 million years of human evolution that keep recurring and that are really important for how we get to be where we are today. So human evolution research is kind of a combination of paleoanthropology and archaeology. And so paleoanthropology is the study of past peoples, past human ancestors, and also primates like chimps and gorillas to look at basically their skeletons and their morphology, so what they look like, how their bones kind of and muscles interact, and how that represents in terms of things like walking, locomotion, speech, so how they are physically. So we can think of paleoanthropology as like the physical component of human evolution. Archaeology is the study of past peoples through their kind of material culture. And so archaeology is really focused on past cultures and how they manifest and how we can try and reconstruct them. So archaeology is the kind of the study of, or at least in terms of human evolution, of how culture kind of increased in complexity, how it changed through time, and kind of looking for these major periods and changes in culture that we see with different human ancestors through time. So these are the three major themes that we can talk about in human evolution, or that we'll talk about today. So the first one is bipedalism. So bipedalism is super important, and it's something that kind of separates us from our nearest living ancestors today, or sorry, our nearest living relatives today, who are chimpanzees. So that's one of the key differences. And if we think about chimpanzees, it's kind of our nearest living ancestors. They're not bipedal, right? They don't walk around on two legs all the time. So that's a really big difference. And we'll talk a little bit about how and why that happened. Increase in brain size. So that's another key difference. If you look at a chimpanzee today, their brain size is much smaller than what we see in humans, probably about coming on to 3 to 4 times smaller. And then the third one there is tool use and culture. So that's another kind of characteristic that we see with humans and is characteristic of human evolution, is the increase in tool use, the increase in cultural complexity. And if you think about that, like how are we interacting today? We're interacting through a computer screen, right? So it's pretty complex culture, pretty complex tools, and kind of speaks to this theme of increasing complexity in tool use and culture through time. So just a couple of key terms and concepts. So evolution is something that, what is human evolution? So kind of at its simplest, it's biological changes in an organism over time through natural selection. And so natural selection is basically this theory or kind of where those that are best adapted to their environment are going to be more likely to survive and reproduce, and their offspring are going to be more successful. And so that kind of makes sense when you think about it, is individuals within a species that are better adapted to their environment, that are able to kind of better survive. Maybe they're able to get more food, they're able to live longer, they're able to live through harsher times better, are going to be more likely to survive and therefore reproduce. And then their genes are going to be passed on to the next generation and so on. And so that's kind of how evolution works in that long-term time scale. And I like that image of Charles Darwin as a monkey. So Charles Darwin and Alfred Wallace were, the first kind of two to formally propose this theory of evolution back in 1859. And when it was initially kind of proposed or put out into the world, Darwin was ridiculed as being, and this is one of the cartoons of. So hominins and hominids. So hominins are humans and the direct human ancestors. Hominids are great apes, humans, and human ancestors. And so this is kind of the big, when we're thinking about human evolution, and sometimes you may see like those branches, the branching trees. So this is that hominid difference is one of those key branches. So hominids encapsulates everything, including chimpanzees, gorillas, etc. But hominins are where we split off from that kind of shared heritage or lineage with chimpanzees, gorillas, other apes, and we start to kind of form into our own, form the characteristics that we see today. And so a lot of this has to do with, bipedalism, tool use, etc. So fossils. Fossils are impressions of plants, insects, and animals. And they're a key part of the, kind of like the record or the information that we use to understand human evolution. They can also be harder remains of animals, plants, and insects. So, fossil remains are basically the kinds that are important for human evolution are bones that turn into stone. So like, for example, up in the top right there, that's Sahelanthropus chidensis. And so this is a potentially an early human ancestor that we'll talk about a little bit more in a second. But they date to 7 million years ago, and their bones are fossilized. So that's kind of, again, their bones, all of the organic component has been kind of replaced by minerals. So it's basically like a stone replica of their skull. And then down the bottom there, we have, these are footprints from a site in Tanzania called Laetoli. And these date to about 3.6 million years ago. And this is really cool because what happened was there was a volcanic eruption that spewed up a bunch of volcanic ash, and that ash kind of settled on the ground and was really soft for a short period of time. And during this period of time, we have at least 2 Australopithecines who were walking across this, I think it's about 17 to 20 meters long. So, and after they'd walked, so they left their footprints there. Very fortunate that nothing happened. And then the volcanic ash hardened and turned into mineral. And so it provides us with a record of however long it took these Australopithecines to walk 17 meters. So if you think about that, like 10 seconds, 3.6 million years ago. It also shows that they were walking on 2 feet, so they were bipedal. So a really unique find, but very important in terms of understanding kind of human evolution, the development of bipedalism. So comparative anatomy is another really important part, and this is where the paleoanthropology comes in. So paleoanthropologists are really, they're really well versed and have a deep knowledge of skeletal anatomy, and especially, kind of how the bones interact with one another and the mechanics of the bones. So how they interact, the muscles, etc., and how they work together to make, like movements and functions. And not just from walking on 2 feet, but how our hands, grasp the different kinds of dexterity. So, having a big kind of bulky grip to precise grip, or, we can have like our fingers play the piano, to even things like how our jaw moves and how all of the different muscles and bones interact to create, this space for us to produce sound, right? And to speak. So paleoanthropologists basically study and compare skeletal anatomy from humans and human ancestors, from hominins and hominids, to try and understand the differences and what those differences mean in terms of kind of the physical, biological, form of human ancestors. So artifacts are important because so they're objects that have been made, modified, or used by human or human ancestor activity. And they basically, they tell us what past people, human ancestors were doing. They tell us about kind of their behaviors. They can tell us whether or not, they were hunting, what kinds of foods they were eating. And they can also tell us about other aspects. So if you look down there in the bottom left, we have some shell beads, that are decorative, they're jewelry. So again, we can think about, well, why are people making jewelry? What sort of symbolic or cultural meaning does that have? And that provides us with insight into, again, thinking about kind of changes in culture, cultural complexity through time. And so archaeology here is the study of past cultures through their material remains. And so archaeology, or the archaeology component of human evolution, is looking at the range of material culture, so the range of artifacts that are being found at these human evolution kind of sites and in the human evolution record, and trying to understand, things like the cognitive capacity or how complex they are to make, and comparing them from time period to time period to look at similarities in traits, similarities in styles, and try and track cultural relationships and the increase or changes in cultural complexity through time. And we'll talk a little bit more about this in a short time. So another kind of more recent approach to studying human evolution is ancient DNA or paleogenetics. And so this has kind of been around probably since, I think, the first Neanderthal DNA was recovered in 1998. And then the first Neanderthal genome, I think, was published in 2010. And then since then, especially in the past 5 years, with advances in paleogenetic methods, et cetera, there's been a kind of a real advances and a lot more paleo DNA, ancient DNA, and it's made a really big and important contribution to understanding human evolution, and especially relationships between different human ancestors. So by comparing genomes, we can see if there was, we can see where they're different, where different kind of traits might differ or be similar. And we can also look for overlap that would indicate how related different populations are. And if there's been interbreeding between different populations, like Neanderthals and humans, for example. And so this is really cool. And this image here is pretty cool as well. It's basically an individual there excavating in like a full kind of clean suit, like a Tyvek suit, to make sure that they're not contaminating the sediment, because they're trying to recover sediment and bone and for DNA analysis at this site in Spain called El Cedrón, which is a Neanderthal site that dates to almost 50,000 years ago. All right, so that's kind of a brief background into some of the major terms and approaches to studying human evolution. So let's talk a little bit about some of these major themes in human evolution. So we have bipedalism, increase in brain size, tool use, and culture. So the first one we'll talk about is bipedalism. So this is kind of a dated image, but still very, very useful image of how bipedalism works and how bipedal, and some of the major differences we see in the skeletal anatomy between chimpanzees, who are our closest living relatives, and modern humans. And so some of the key things that we see in order for modern humans to be habitually bipedal are that our pelvis is much kind of shorter and broader. And that's because our pelvis has to support the whole upper part of our body. We see that, our chest cavity becomes narrower. And again, that's to help with the center of gravity, to make sure that the center of gravity kind of sits right in the center of our body. We have, smaller neck muscles. We have that kind of S curve in our spine. And again, that's to kind of help support all of the upper body sitting on top. And then we have differences in the arm and leg proportion. So with humans, our legs are a little bit longer than our arms, whereas it's kind of the reverse with chimpanzees. And that's because they spend a lot of time in trees and they're swinging around, kind of brachiating, etc. So these are some pretty major changes in our physical forms, in our skeletal anatomy. And these changes are argued to have taken place, over the course of, starting from about 7 million years ago, up until, I guess, we see modern humans kind of about 250,000 years ago. So it's kind of a long term, but some of these major changes happen in that period between about 7 and 1 million years ago. So who were the earliest bipeds, or the earliest kind of hominins to habitually walk on 2 feet and to use bipedalism? So we have a couple of different candidates. We have Sahelanthropus jidensis, who, if you think back to the fossil skull that we were looking at, that's the same individual, and he was a reconstruction. So they date to about 7 million years ago, and they're from, their fossils are recovered from the site in Chad, which is in North Africa. We have Aurontogenesis, who dates to about 6 million years ago, and then Ardipithecus ramidus, who dates to about 5.6 to 4.3 million years ago. And what's interesting is with all of these kind of early bipeds, there's no, again, evolution is kind of a slow process. So there's no distinct shift. So we see some changes, but often it kind of looks like, they're starting to walk on 2 feet, but they're also still spending time in trees. And we see that potentially all the way up to 1.5 million years ago, potentially even later. So this is really cool. So this is looking at the foramen magnum. And so the foramen magnum is where your spinal cord connects to your skull. And because, again, this is an adaptation for bipedalism, because we're upright all the time, our skull sits kind of right on top of our spinal cord. But because chimpanzees are quadrupedal, or they're spending a lot of time on 4 legs or forelimbs, their spinal cord attaches kind of further at the back. So if you take your hand and you kind of move it up from the base of your neck, of the back of your skull, you'll see there's a bit of a bump there. And so that bump, kind of at the back of your head, that's probably around where your spinal cord would have attached if you were quadrupedal like a chimpanzee. But instead, as you can see with modern humans, it's kind of right at the base of our skull. So with Sahelanthropus, what we see is we start to see the foramen magnum move to a much more, we'll call it like modern or bipedal position in the base of their skull there. And so that's a really good indicator for us that Sahelanthropus was spending a lot more time on 2 feet, and that they were becoming habitually bipedal. So with the other two, Aurontogenesis and Ardipithecus ramidus, we're also looking at the parts of the body that will tell us about bipedalism. So with Aurontogenesis, this is the upper leg bone, so your thigh bone. And what we see there is a couple of big changes in that it looks much more human than it does chimpanzee. So it has a longer neck, and that neck means, so as humans, when we're standing up, our knees, our legs kind of angle in, so we're kind of knock-kneed. And that's to help with our balance and to help with our locomotion. Chimpanzees are fairly straight in terms of their legs. So having that longer neck on the which you guys can kind of see, if you can see my marker there, between the long femoral neck, which is kind of where the top of your thigh bone articulates with your pelvis. That indicates that there's more of an angle, and again, that they're standing upright. With Ardipithecus, one of the interesting things that we see is the toe bones. So again, we don't have full skeletons from any of these individuals. We just get bits and pieces in the fossil record. And so that makes it incredibly hard for us to try and piece together what they look like and how they figure into the human evolution story. With Ardipithecus, we have like a couple of toe bones and then also some like teeth and cranial remains. But the toe bones look much more modern than they do kind of like chimpanzee. So they're shorter, which is an indicator that, chimpanzees have grasping feet, right? Humans don't have grasping feet because we're standing on our feet all day. So with Ardipithecus, we're seeing shorter toe bones, which is an indicator that they're not being used for grasping. And also the surface of that joint kind of angles up. And that's also another good indicator that just in how, when you're standing up, that they're standing bipedally or standing on two legs a lot of the time. So some of the big questions kind of around this major theme of bipedalism are why? Why do we see it? So if we're thinking about evolution in terms of natural selection, bipedalism must have offered a pretty significant advantage, right? Because if we compare like what's the chimpanzee skeleton look like to the human skeleton, there's some pretty major reorganization there. They look very different. So what are the advantages? What is driving this bipedalism? And it's probably not just one thing. It's probably a combination of things. And this combination of things is helping individuals who are bipedal to survive better and be kind of better fit their environment and be selected for, thinking about natural selection. So these include hands-free locomotion. So if you're thinking about it, instead of walking around on the ground using all four limbs, instead you're only using two. So that frees up two of your hands to be able to carry things or to do other things with them, right? And so if you're going out and collecting food, or if you're going out and collecting other things, all of a sudden you can carry a bunch of stuff, in two hands. You can use things as you're kind of walking or running or moving about. So that's potentially, a contributor to why this is important. Another big thing is the change in the environment. So the major human evolution kind of happened in Africa. And during this period in Africa, from about 7 million years ago up to about 5 million years ago, the region gets kind of broadly much drier. And that means that the environment changes from wooded environments where there's lots and lots of trees to more open grassland environment where there aren't as many trees. And so in that respect, all of a sudden, if there are fewer trees, you're going to have to spend more time on the ground, and you're going to have to spend more time kind of moving around on the ground. So bipedalism may work there. And then bipedalism is also more efficient for traveling long distances. You think about kind of long distance running, things like that. But bipedalism is essentially, you're spending less energy per kilometer as you're moving, kind of across these long distances. And so spending less energy or having more efficient motion could also be one of the, an adaptation or an advantage to being bipedal. So these are some of the three main kind of arguments for bipedalism. But again, it's probably not just one, it's probably a combination of these things. Okay, so let's move on and talk a little bit about brain size. So with brain size, this is, again, one of the key things that we see in human evolution is this change and increase generally in brain size through time. So chimpanzee brain size is about 350 to 400 cubic centimeters. And we start to see, so that's quite small compared to modern humans today, which is about 1450. And then we start to see this increase. We're looking at Australopithecus africanus is about 450. And then as we're moving forward through time, brain size increases until with like Neanderthals actually had bigger brains than modern humans, a little bit bigger. So there's some interesting things kind of happen there. But why is brain size important? So if we think about brains and cognition and thinking, complex thought, it allows us, having bigger brains allows for kind of more complex thought. And that more complex thought allows us to communicate with each other kind of more efficiently and better. So it allows us to develop these complex concepts. It allows us to plan better. And if you think, you're thinking about kind of, where am I going to get food from? Where are the food sources out on the landscape? Which is the best one to go to? Things like that, really important. So having kind of that extra computing power is great to help kind of process that information and develop strategies. And same with communication. Again, the way that we're communicating now, not just through kind of like shared language, but also through the technology, allows us to share ideas, complex ideas, concepts, things that are kind of super abstract, very broadly, with a lot of like fidelity, so that people understand that the meaning isn't being lost. And so those are real advantages in terms of trying to survive in the environment. What's kind of unique about brain size, or the brain itself, though, is that even though the brain is only about 2% of our total body mass, it takes up about 20% of our energy. So again, when we're thinking about human evolution, there's always a trade-off or a catch, right? So if we're going to have bigger brains, then they're going to require more energy, which means we're going to have to get better at finding things to eat. We're going to have to become more efficient and better foragers, better hunters, better gatherers, etc. So some of these major increases in brain size that we see in the course of human evolution are linked to potentially changes in our subsistence patterns, changes in how we're eating and what we're eating. So there's an argument out there that there's a change in diet, and especially with the consumption of more meat in the diet, because most of meat became kind of an increasing component of the diet, is related to an increase in brain size. And so eating animals or consuming animals, animals generally are more nutrient dense than plant foods. So they give us kind of more more energy, more calories, and they also give us kind of different nutrition, enzymes, things like that contribute to kind of helping to power our brains and growing the brain. So there's an argument out there that as our human ancestors are transitioning to eat more meat, and going from maybe being better scavengers to starting to hunt small game, to rising up to becoming kind of like one of the apex predators in the environment by the time, probably about 500,000 years ago, that this is related to increase in brain size. And part of this is just because we're getting more energy from our diet, and we're able to use that energy to power the more expensive, bigger brains that we have. And so kind of linked here and linked into this are major changes in technology. And I've got some replica stone tools here today that we can look at as well. But we start to see the earliest stone tools in the record about 3.3 million years ago. And they come from a site called Lumakwi 3, which was in Kenya. And this is what they look like. So they're really interesting. They're fairly basic. So what we know is that the individuals, probably as Australopithecus, that was making these stone tools, knew which kind of stone would be good for making them, because you need a certain kind of stone that's going to break in a predictable way. But apart from that, they were kind of just hitting one stone with another, and then that produces these sharp flakes, and then they were using the flakes themselves. And this site was actually found by accident, which is kind of funny. So the researchers were going to another site, and they took a wrong turn, and they drove for an hour and a half, 2 hours down this dirt track until they figured out that they'd taken a wrong turn. And then they stopped and they got out and they decided, oh, well, we're already here. We may as well have a look around and see what's there. And then they find the oldest stone tools that have been, that we've recorded to date. So that's pretty cool, and also kind of demonstrates, just the luck. A little bit of luck is involved in researching human evolution. And again, that's just because there's so few artifacts that survive, and we have some idea of where they are, but actually finding them is really challenging. So the older one is kind of the earliest stone tool technology that we see both, across Africa. So we see it in Eastern Africa, we see it in Southern Africa. We also see it in Europe, in Georgia, about 1.92 million years ago. So that's really cool because the older one is a stone tool technology, and it's basically made using the same technique or the same strategy to kind of knock flakes off the core, right? So it shows that this strategy was both effective and that there was some communication between the different groups because we see it everywhere, right? And so this is it's spreading because it's effective, it's adaptive, it's advantageous, and it indicates that different groups, whether they were kind of sharing or copying or mimicking, were picking it up and also doing the same sort of thing. But it's pretty basic. So you take a cobble and then you knock a couple of flakes off of it. So it kind of looks like this guy here. And then typically they fit, for whatever reason, fairly nicely in your hand, and you can use them to pound and bash things. And as you're knocking off those flakes, which are on the other side, on the right side of the slide, they give you these sharp edges and you can use them to kind of cut things. And so they were probably used for working both, animal remains and plant remains. So as we move forward through time, so we see, the older one, probably from about 2.5 million years ago to maybe about 1.7 million years ago. And then we move on and we move forward through time. And with Homo erectus, we find the Acheulean hand axe. So Homo erectus is kind of a pretty big change from Australopithecus and Homo habilis, in that Homo erectus has a bigger brain. They're much taller. They're probably between about 5'10", 5'11", and they're kind of pretty. They're very habitually bipedal. They're starting to be better hunters, and they start to make this stone tool called a hand axe. And again, this is a replica, but I have one here. You guys can see it. And it's called a hand axe because it kind of looks like an axe head. So it's been worked on both sides. So it's called bifacial. So they remove flakes from this side, and then they flip it over and they remove flakes from this side, and that's how you get this kind of. You can kind of see the zipper-like edge, maybe how it kind of goes up and down. So that's pretty cool, and it's a hand axe because they again kind of fits in your hand a little bit, and this part back here is fairly dull compared to the cutting surface. So these hand axes we see pretty much all over Africa, Europe, Asia, and they're with Homo erectus sites. And so again, one of the cool things is that we're seeing a change or an increase in complexity in stone tool use. So it's being worked on both sides, and it's a technology that's being spread kind of throughout the world. So it's clearly really advantageous and really important. So it's harder to make. It's also more challenging, or it requires more steps than the older one to make. So it's a good indicator that we have a change in cognition as well. As we move further forward through time to about 300,000 years ago onwards, we see these things called Levallois cores or prepared cores. And so these are incredibly challenging stone tool technologies to make. So I have a replica Levallois core here, and this is what they look like. And this one still has some tape on the back. So the thing about Levallois cores is that instead of like this part isn't the tool. What we're actually looking for is this part here. So the core is made in such a way that as you're knocking off flakes, so like you would hit down here and then this guy would crack off, that you would get a series of flakes that basically look totally the same. So it's kind of like you're increasing your production line, right? So instead of just using one big lump of stone tool like we have for the Acheulean hand axe, we're making a lot of these little ones. So we're being more efficient, or there's an increase in efficiency with how the stone tool technology is being made. And then so with this core here, you can kind of see if we pop it up like that. So there'll be a couple of other flakes that came off first, and this guy will come off, and then you'll probably get one or two more out of this core. And again, they'll all look very similar, which is great because if this one breaks, then there's another one that you can kind of slot in or use, etc. So that's super important. It's super cool. And it also indicates a real big change in cognition. So it takes, so one of the things that we do to study stone tool manufacture is we map out the steps, kind of like decision trees, to see which, how you're going from basically just a core to specific, this endpoint stone tool. So in order to do, so when we're looking at Lavalwa, we're seeing more and more decisions because it's super complex to try and make these cores that are going to look exactly, they're going to produce flakes that look exactly like that. And so some of the other trends that we start to see in stone tool technology is stone tools become smaller through time. As you can kind of see, so on the bottom left here, we have the older one, then we have the hand axe, we have Lavalwa, all the way up to microliths, which we start to see kind of, much more recently, about 50,000 years ago. We also see manufacturing strategies become more complex or complicated through time, as well as being more efficient. So I have one more core here that I'm going to show you, or one more stone tool technology. So this is a little bladelet core. So you can see it's much smaller than the Lavalwa core, and it's much smaller than even the hand axe. But what you kind of get from these guys is a whole bunch of blades. So like this one here, so you can knock this one off and you kind of go around the whole thing, so you can kind of see all the indents from the previous flakes. So it's going to give us a whole bunch of these little blades. And again, we're looking at like changes in technology. We're looking at increase in kind of efficiency. And then these blades, we can use for a whole bunch of different tools, and they're interchangeable. So again, it's a more, more complex kind of form of stone tool use. And so that blade core, we see that about 50,000 years ago. And we see actually both Neanderthals and modern humans are making blades using that technology. And so one of the things that we can do to look at how, stone tool use through time is kind of attach, like electrodes and map out the brain as people are being taught how to make stone tools and as experts are making stone tools. And this shows us which parts of the brain are being used or being engaged during this process. And one of the cool findings from this study is that the parts of the brain that are responsible for kind of thinking about and making stone tools also seem to be the same parts of the brain that are related to language. So there's an argument being made that as people are kind of figuring out how to make stone tools, they're also starting to develop the cognition for language, which kind of makes sense if you're thinking about grammar rules and how we put things together to form words and languages and sentences. It's the same sort of thinking, that same sort of, as you're making stone tools. Like, so I need to get to this. This is the point that I want to make. This is the stone tool that I want to make. Which kind of trajectories or which decisions, which way should I use words, language, etc. to get to the point? How should I, which decisions should I use to make, to get from that piece of stone to the actual stone tool? So this is kind of a broad, a broad outline of human evolution through time, with a lot of human ancestors on there. And it's probably, it's really challenging to keep up to date with this because even though it's only February, I think there have been 3 or 4 big papers, big publications that have come out that have an impact on how we understand human evolution at different, different levels. But it's also really important to think about like how many different human ancestors there are. And one of the challenges with human evolution research is to figure out how these different ancestors are related, not only to one another, but also to modern humans. And that's where kind of ancient DNA is really playing a role. So I think if you get one thing from this talk or one key takeaway, hopefully you get more than one, is that, evolution is not linear or straight line, but it's actually way more complicated. And we have, different human ancestors, multiple human ancestors at the same place, at the same time, interacting with one another and trying to track, those interactions and what resulted from them is really challenging. And especially as we get further forward in time, we start to see like humans interacting with Neanderthals, humans interacting with another kind of human ancestor, Denisovans. There's little Homo floresiensis also around. And so there's, probably even up to about 50,000 years ago, 40,000 years ago, there are at least 3 or 4 other human ancestors who are thought to be potentially, or were thought to be different species on Earth at the same time as modern humans, and we were interacting with them. And in most cases, we were interbreeding with them, which is really interesting too. So we have a little bit of time left, and I wanted to spend that time talking about Neanderthals. So Neanderthals are kind of the closest human ancestors. So we have the most, like our genetic relationship is the closest. We share a lot of DNA. And one of the kind of key driving questions in the past 50 plus years of human evolution, well, 100 plus years of human evolution research, is how are humans and Neanderthals related? And then why do we have humans now but no Neanderthals? Why are there no Neanderthals today? So on the bottom, or the image here, we have the bottom left is a recreation of a modern human, and then on the bottom right is a recreation of a Neanderthal. And they don't really look that different, right? But if we have a look at their skulls, they do look a little bit different. And I have some replicas, so these aren't real. These are replicas of a Neanderthal skull right here. And then again, this is a replica, it's not real, of a human skull as well. You guys can kind of see some of the differences. And so when we're looking at them, we can see a couple of things straight off the bat, right? So we can see some major differences in terms of how the skulls look, and I'll put them on the slide here. I just want to make sure I don't drop them. You guys can see them both there. So we have some pretty major differences in what they look like, in the face, in what their skull looks like, etc. And we can see that in the slide there too, right? So Neanderthals their brains are a little bit bigger, but they're kind of also a different shape. They're more elongated. So the skull itself kind of stretches back further, whereas the modern human here, our skulls are much more kind of spherical or rounded, So our brains are a little bit smaller, but they're also shaped a little bit differently, which is super interesting. We also see differences in the face. So Neanderthals have these big brow ridges, which we don't have with modern humans. If you run your finger kind of from your forehead down, very soft brow ridges. With Neanderthals, you try and do that, there's definitely like a ledge, right? The face is bigger, the eye sockets, the eyes are bigger, the nose is bigger, the teeth are bigger. And here's the mandible, or the bottom part of the jaw. And one of the really interesting things that we see is that Neanderthals don't have a chin. So this is totally flat here. So even the male Neanderthals, there's no chin, and they have kind of a bigger jaw. With modern humans, you guys can see there's definitely a chin. So even though the chin is not as pronounced in females, modern humans still have a chin. And part of that is potentially because we have smaller faces, we have smaller teeth, and it could just be like our faces kind of shrinking. So some other key differences that we see between Neanderthals and modern humans are differences in what's called the hyoid. And the hyoid is a bone that sits in your throat, and it's one of the few bones in your body that's not actually attached to any other bones. So it sits in the cartilage and muscles of your throat there. And so because it sits right there, and that's a key it's right in your vocal tract, it's thought to influence or inform how we make sounds, how we make noises. And there are some subtle differences between human and Neanderthal hyoids. So even though Neanderthals are argued to have been able to produce sounds, some people think that they may not have been able to produce as many different sounds as modern humans. And that could potentially mean that maybe their ability to communicate, or at least expressively communicate, was a little bit limited compared to modern humans. What we do know for certain is that humans and Neanderthals successfully interbred, or they swapped genes. And so most people today have between 1 to 4% of our DNA is shared with Neanderthals, which is a pretty big amount considering that the last time humans and Neanderthals interbred or swapped genes was probably about 40,000 years ago. But we see, and again, this is through the ancient DNA and the paleogenetics, that modern humans and Neanderthals interbred at a couple of times in the past 100,000 years. So once at 100,000 years ago, and then again more recently around 65,000, 50,000, 40,000 years ago, which is super interesting. And it suggests, for thinking about a biological definition of a species as, or two separate groups that can't successfully interbreed, that humans and Neanderthals were not different species, were the same species. And clearly we were successfully interbreeding because we still share 1 to 4% of our DNA with Neanderthal, which is pretty cool. But that also means, so if we were able to successfully interbreed and swap genetics, we were, probably swapping ideas, talking, culture, sharing kind of different, different life ways, subsistence, hunting, things like that, stone tool making. So why are Neanderthals not here today? Oh, so I just wanted to, so this is an individual called Oz1 from Romania. And this individual recently, they were able to extract some DNA, and the DNA indicates, so it's the most Neanderthal DNA in a modern human that we've seen. I think it's like almost 9%. And it indicates that this individual had a Neanderthal relative about 4 to 6 generations ago. So that means that their great grandparent potentially, or their great grandparent was a Neanderthal. Which is pretty cool. And again, definite evidence of swapping genes and interbreeding. So why humans? Why do we not see any Neanderthals today? And that's a great question, and one that's really hard to answer. There's probably a couple of different explanations, and they may be linked. So one of them is potentially, it's been argued by some people that Neanderthals were not as good communicators. Although there's recent evidence coming out suggesting that Neanderthals were potentially making rock art, definite evidence that Neanderthals were making pendants and jewelry, things like that. But maybe there was something in just kind of maybe limiting the sounds or the ability to communicate. So that's a complicated one. It's really hard to try and assess that or test that hypothesis from the human evolution record. Another argument is that humans were potentially more adaptable, and this may, so the difference in brain, so Neanderthals had a bigger brain, but humans may have had a more efficient brain, because if you remember, brains are very energy expensive. So we may have had, like, our brains may have reorganized and didn't need to be that big, and that may have been an important adaptation. And we also see modern humans kind of living in a whole variety of environments. So there may have been something that modern humans were just more adaptable to a whole variety of environments than Neanderthals. But again, that's really hard for us to kind of test. And then the last kind of potential here is that modern human population may have just been bigger. So they may have just kind of swamped Neanderthals, in terms of it's just kind of like a genetic thing. There's just way more modern humans and fewer Neanderthals, and as they're kind of interbreeding and kind of swapping genes, the Neanderthals just kind of get swamped by modern human DNA. So no one's really sure what the answer is. It's probably some combination of those three, plus maybe some other, complicated things, and we'll see. That's the fun thing about human evolution, is that because there's so much still out there to find, and there's so much analysis to be done, that our picture of human evolution kind of changes fairly, or updates is probably a better way to say it. It updates quite frequently. Okay, well, thank you so much for your time. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. And I guess if there are any questions, I think we have a couple of minutes I'm happy to answer.
Yeah, we're definitely going to go into question phase. So if the participants have any questions, you can type it in the chat. Just because we are recording, we don't want you to turn on your mic or your video. And while we're waiting for that, we actually had one question sent in by an educator, and she asks a general question of what kind of advice would you give to students who want to go into the field of anthropology and, perhaps even specialize in paleoanthropology or archaeology?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So what advice would I give is, so if you're interested in going into anthropology, archaeology, paleoanthropology, I think, a great place to probably start in high school is taking some of the history courses, and also taking some of the science courses as well, because there's, a lot of the methods that are used, especially as we go further back in time, to date and look at some of these artifacts are kind of using the scientific techniques. And then to think about taking anthropology classes, at university. So the first year introduction to anthropology courses, both here and at the University of Winnipeg, are really good at providing kind of some of the background of human evolution. And it's a great way to kind of jump in and get your feet wet, and kind of think about, is this something that's of interest to me? That, and I guess there's probably, I can't think off the top of my head, but follow some of the people on social media that are posting a lot and that are reputable, so that if they're affiliated with a university institution, then they're probably a reputable source. But I know on Twitter there's a lot of great discussion, debate, and posting of new results, and in the conversation, which is, I guess, online, kind of like magazine. It provides some context for some of the new, I think the conversation.ca or the conversation.com. And they provide a lot of background to some of the really big findings that happened throughout the course of the year, etc.
Thank you. So it doesn't look like we have any questions in the chat yet, but I would like to give some more value to anyone who watches the webinar afterwards. So field school is, really important when you go into archaeology, or really a lot of fields in anthropology. Do you want to share your experiences of, when you were an undergrad going through field school, what kind of value you got out of, I don't know how many field schools you went to, but I know each of them has their own important things that you get out of it. If you want to share some of your experiences.
Yeah, for sure. So I did my undergrad at the U of M here. And so our field school, I took the U of M one way back now, it was 2006. And that was just 5 kilometers north of Winnipeg. And it was a site that had a historic component as well as a pre-contact component. I think it dated a couple of thousand years ago. And I learned a lot of that field school. So field schools for archaeology, paleoanthropology are super important in terms of just being able to learn some of those basic skills. I think, I know a lot of students have asked me, do I need to go and do a specific paleoanthropology field school, or do I need to go and do a field school in Europe or somewhere else? And my answer, my experience is probably not, unless there's something really specific that is being taught at that field school that you really specifically want to do. The skills and techniques that I learned in the field school were applicable to all of the stuff that I do now. And as you kind of continue forward, it's really, that first field school is really important for that experience. And hopefully you can get that during your undergrad. But as you move through, if you want to continue on in paleoanthropology or human evolution, archaeology, things like that, you probably have to go to grad school, and you'll get opportunities in grad school to kind of develop those skills as well. And that's part of what grad school is developing those skills. Field school, highly recommend doing one. And I think if you don't want to spend thousands and thousands of dollars going overseas, there's generally some great options that are fairly local. And you get to connect with some interesting, great people who work here. So that's my kind of thoughts on field school. Was there a second part to that question, Sinead, that I forgot?
No, that's about it. Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Doesn't look like we have any more questions. If you have any other comments that you'd like to add that you feel like are maybe important, feel free to add those.
No, not too much. If anyone does have any questions, comments, concerns, you're more than welcome to reach out and send me an email. I think that information will probably be posted with the slides, maybe. If not,
Sure.
benjamin.collins@umanitoba.ca. And I'm more than happy to chat about human evolution, archaeology, things like that. Yeah, I hope if you're viewing this, you enjoyed it and you got something out of it.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, we can definitely add your email if that's okay with you. So I guess we'll wrap it up if our participants don't have any questions. So we're just going to say thank you again, Dr. Collins, for taking the time out of your day to come do this webinar. And I hope everyone has a great day, and definitely reach out if you have any questions about paleoanthropology. All right,
Great.
bye everyone.
Bye.